Hello and welcome to second look at econ for the third video in our econ series. As you can tell, this one is about money and credit. So our current system of money and banking, and the one which has been predominant since about the mid-17th century, is called fractional reserve banking. First of all, why do we say system of money and banking? It kind of begs the question because it seems like there would be two different concepts. But we say it because money and banking are inextricably mixed up with each other because of the practice of fractional reserve banking. To repeat, under the system of fractional reserve banking, here from here on referred to as FRB, it can also be labeled a system of private money creation. All money is credit. Why is this? Because the system of fractional reserve banking permits the banks the privilege to create money at the same time they create credit. So instead of lending out the savings they are endowed, they actually create bills, or actually in the modern times right now, they don't even create bills. They just create account or units of account in people's bank accounts just by adding numbers into a computer. So money and credit are not inherently the same with each other. It is only a matter of monetary policy. It's only a matter of the continuation or discontinuation of the practice of fractional reserve banking. So I just say that to reiterate that whether money continues to be credit or money becomes separate from credit, as it often has been throughout history, is purely just a matter of policy change. So because of this situation, in order to understand money, one must first understand credit, which is what we'll do now. Here's the way banking works. Banks may issue $9 of credit for every $10 of deposits or money they possess. They're usually required by law to hold in their vaults a certain amount of money called reserves, those reserves being comprised of the deposits that people give them. Reserves are often required by law to be made up of base money. Historically, base money has either been government coin, gold, or silver, greenbacks, or government bonds. On extremely rare occasions in history, base monies have been other banks' banknotes. I believe in the system of banking the United States had between 1865 and 1913. There was a tiered system of state banks, national banks, and national city banks, each of which could use the banknotes from the tier above it as base money. So it was a system of pyramiding credit upon credit. But base money is also often referred to as high-powered money. And credit is the notes which the banks issue, lending money that they themselves create to their clients. So this diagram on the right, you can see how this is theoretically how it's supposed to work. They're supposed to issue 90%, the credit money on top of the base money. It's not quite how it works these days, although it may have been the way that it worked in the past. Okay, so we know that for every $10 deposited into a bank, $9 in credit will be created. Economists then posit that out of the $9 in credit created, will all be spent to move to someone who wants to put it in their bank account, meaning that this $9 will then be deposited, and then $8.10 will be created and lent out by the banks. Then $7.29. then $6.56, and so on, until the process reaches an asymptotal endpoint somewhere around $1, meaning a 1 to $1 ratio. Right. So if you keep taking 90% of a smaller and smaller number, the money multiplier will be less and less until it, as we say, reaches an asymptotal endpoint, meaning a point where no further credit money can be issued off of the base money. The implication here is that for every $1 base money in the economy, there are $9 of credit money. Assuming that the reserve ratio is 10%, this means that credit money comprises 90% of the money supply and base money comprises 10%. This whole process of money percolating into the economy shows that the money supply is leveraged basically on a factor of 10 on the existing base money supply, is known as the money multiplier. So what is the difference between credit money and base money? We should learn a little bit about these two concepts if we're going to try to have a better understanding of the monetary system. So credit money, because it is lent into existence rather than simply spent into existence, has the imperative to return to its owner, right? When you lend something into existence, it needs to come back to you. So what that means in terms of its monetary function is that it is destructible or fragile. So for example, if everyone paid off their loans all at the same time, just hypothetically speaking, the credit money supply would shrink to zero immediately. Or if there were a very large credit event such that everyone went bankrupt in sort of a chain reaction of debt exposure in a very short amount of time, then the credit money supply would go to zero again. So credit money is inherently fragile because it's subject to being paid back and it's subject to bankruptcies and all these sorts of things. Secondly, it's issued at cost. So this is a form of money which comes into existence bearing interest. So for every $1 of credit money lent into existence, there is the $1 plus the rate of interest attached to it in terms of liabilities. So hypothetically, in a system in which credit money comprised the entirety of the money supply, this would mean that at any given time, liabilities would always outweigh assets because the money supply itself is bearing an interest burden. Base money, in comparison, or in contradiction rather, has the possibility of being indestructible. Base money can either be lent into existence or spent into existence, depending on the government. In the cases in which it's lent into existence, this happens with bond sales, and in the cases where it's spent into existence, this happens with simply printing money or even coining money. So like nickels and dimes and quarters and things like this. This is money that is spent into the economy rather than lent into the economy. So just as a reminder, anything that is lent into the economy, insofar as it functions as a money, is fragile or destructible in its role as a money. Anything that is spent into the economy as a money is indestructible because it has no sort of return obligation. Okay. Base money can also either be issued at cost or it can be issued without cost. So again, the example of nickels and dimes and quarters, these things are issued without an interest burden because they're simply spent into the economy. But then bond issues are issued at cost because it's essentially the government borrowing money from the citizens. So yeah, to sum this page up, credit money is inherently fragile and inherently bears interest, whereas base money, it's not inherent that it's either indestructible, or it's not inherent that it's either destructible or interest bearing, but it is often true. For most of the governments in the world, they do indeed often issue money through bond sales, which of course bear interest to the people who bought them. Just like a loan. Okay. Right. And also, the last sort of defining feature of base money is that it is the money off of which credit money can be issued. So that's why it's called high-powered money, because when base money is injected into the banking system, it means that banks will issue credit on top of it, or pyramided off of it. Base money is issued by the government, and credit money is issued by the banks. This is a very dangerous scenario that we were exposed to, because the M3 money supply metric says that only about 3% of the money supply is base money. This is in contradiction with our money multiplier theory. Technically, the base money as a share of the total money supply should be 10%, since the reserve ratio is 10%, but we'll talk about that later. This means that 97% of the American money supply is credit money. Only a small fraction of government-issued base money is in coinage. Coinage is the only debt-free money issued in the United States. All bills bear interest to the bondholders. So what this means is that if there were a big enough and bad enough credit event, or if everyone decided to pay back their debts at the same time and had the ability to do so, hypothetically speaking, once again, this means that 97% of the money supply would disappear overnight. Why does it matter? Who cares if the money supply disappears? Well, the money supply is important, as is its stability. The money supply is the basis for the price level, and the price level is basically a term that economists use to describe the aggregate metric of all the prices throughout an economy. A good money supply is one which expands with the expansion of population, commerce, and technology, and does not overexpand. Why is it important that it doesn't overexpand? This causes inflation, which means higher prices and possibly distortions in the market, meaning production in places where none should be, and no production in places where it ought to be. Why is it important that it doesn't drop below a certain rate of expansion? Well, we'll get to that. So if you raise the money supply, then the price level goes up, right? Yes. What about lowering the money supply? We'll get to that. So deflation is what we call the scenario in which the price level drops. This is every economist's worst nightmare. Let's see why. In the 1930s, when the American economy was in its worst ever depression, there was little demand for both labor and capital, and as a result, there were no profits or wages being paid out. It's rather uncontroversially accepted that the responsibility for this result falls on the shoulders of the Federal Reserve for allowing the money supply to drop so sharply. It was during this period that Irving Fisher, a famous American economist, developed his theory of debt deflation, which is the standard for explaining deflation's causes, effects, and problems, especially insofar as we're discussing the Great Depression in America. Firstly, what is the problem with the money supply shrinking or even expanding too slowly? It puts a downward pressure on prices, but people are naturally disinclined to lower their own prices on their goods, be it their labors or their products, and they're not wrong. Imagine a business owner. For some reason, the money supply falls sharply, and the amount of currency necessary for commerce to proceed normally at the current price level is insufficient. Should he simply lower his prices and wait for all his competitors and suppliers to lower their prices as well, so they can unanimously transition together to a new equilibrium at a lower price level? No. Although this is a good decision for the whole economy, it is a bad business decision. Why should he keep paying the costs of labor, land, and capital at the older, higher price level, but sell his products at the newer, lower level price level? He will lose money. Should he not instead reduce his exposure to the shrunken money supply problem by cutting his costs, scaling back his operations if necessary, and riding out the changes, and then going back to normal later, once prices have adjusted, and selling at a new lower price level is justified by his costs at the same new lower price level? This is a smart decision, right? But what happens when businesses in general follow this route? It means large-scale unemployment, but even worse for them, the large-scale unemployment deprives consumers of an income stream with which to buy the business's goods, meaning that the businesses, acting in their own self-interests by reducing labor costs, actually sentence themselves to lower and lower profits. This is a paradox of the economy. The benefits of reducing labor costs are internalized to the firm, but the detriments are externalized to the rest of the economy. So when everyone reduces labor costs, then the detriments are felt economy-wide. And this is precisely what happened in the Great Depression. This is what Irving Fisher realized. Not only did he realize this, but he also realized that shrinking money supplies meant that the burden of debt as a share of the real economy increased. Credit contracts were often signed in nominal and not real terms, meaning nominal meaning in terms of current money supply, and not real terms meaning as a share of the size of the economy. This means that at the lower price level, the debts agreed to at the higher price level become much more expensive. Okay, so when the price level goes down, the debts agreed to at the higher price level are still binding and contracts of obligation. So the debt burden increases as a share of the economy in real terms. What is the problem with this? It's an unholy trinity. Increased debt burden, mass unemployment, and flagging sales. This means that more businesses will have to lay off workers, and many of them will default on their loans, which, as we know, since credit money is destructible, will mean that more and more of the money supply will disappear. So if businesses are defaulting en masse, great portions of the money supply are disappearing. What does this do? It exacerbates the original effect of the original shrinking in money supply. It's like a positive feedback loop, meaning that each new input of information intensifies the original effect. With each shrink in the money supply, more layoffs, more bankruptcies, and less sales become likely, meaning that there will be more shrinkages in the money supply. It's a vicious cycle. Okay, so this is why it's really important that we be aware about the fact that basically our entire money supply is comprised of credit money, because it puts us in a constant state of financial fragility where um, should any sort of problem occur with the banking system, it means that the entire money supply is at risk. Right. Okay, so yeah, if the money supply were indestructible and not based on credit, then bankruptcies and defaults would have no effect on the money supply. So essentially, under a fractional reserve banking system, the economy is in peril of self-destruction at any moment. All it takes is a big enough crisis. This is why banks are so vigorously protected by the government. It is also why the Federal Reserve System exists. Banks are able to use their position as stewards of the money supply to extort privileges, protections, and exemptions from the government. So think about this. If the United States government did not protect the big banks and did not constantly supply the big banks with fresh reserves, to keep them solvent and liquid, then we would be at risk of having our whole money supply disappear. So, although it sounds crooked and shady, it's actually in the interests of the government and the public to protect and prop up the banks under this system of privately created money. That's the big if. Under the system of privately created money, it is in the public interest to prop up the banks. So yeah, um, as long as banks are responsible for the money supply, then they will basically be able to use this um, central sort of gatekeeper role to the economy um, to amass for themselves greater privileges. Okay, so that's the story on deflation. It's an absolute disaster, and it's to be avoided at all costs. What about her sister, inflation? Well, maybe if you watch the news or C-SPAN, you'll hear about the Federal Reserve and its imperative to balance its efforts of fighting unemployment with its efforts of fighting inflation. Basically, the mandate of the Federal Reserve is to keep employment as high as possible without being too inflationary. What's the problem with inflation? Well, this is a simple question with a complex answer, and in order to answer it, we'll have to unpack some things first. Before we ask what the problem with inflation is, we need to know what it is. Inflation is generally understood to mean an upward movement in some kind of aggregate price level. Some economists in the past defined inflation as any expansion in the money supply. But what's the difference between upticks in the price level and upticks in the money supply? Print money and prices rise, right? I know we said this earlier, but actually it's not exactly true. While it's true that monetary expansion is prerequisite for rising prices, it is not deterministic, meaning monetary expansion does not a priori necessitate rising prices. Well, how does this work? Prices are essentially a ratio between the supply of goods and the supply of money. If the supply of money increases while the supply of goods does not, then prices rise. So in that case, those classical economists who define inflation as any expansion in the money supply would be in agreement with our modern definition. If the supply of goods increases while the supply of money does not, prices fall. If both the supply of money and supply of goods rise in tandem, then prices remain level. The reason that monetary expansion is not necessarily inflationary is this. The increased demand affected by new purchasing power within an economy can affect an increased supply of goods by bringing previously unused factors of production, such as unused labor, idle capital, or idle land, into production. What does this mean in layman's terms? If the money supply expands in such a way that idle factors of production are brought out of idleness and into use so that the supply of goods also expands, then the monetary expansion is not inflationary. If the money supply expands in such a way that idle factors of production are not brought out of idleness, or if there are no idle factors remaining, then it definitely will be inflationary. So most economists take this as sort of a rule of thumb that monetary expansion during times of depression is not inflationary, right? Because if it's a depression, then that means that there are lots of resources, labor, and capital that aren't being used, which means that the economy is not producing at its normal output. So yes, if you did increase the money supply to bring demand back to its normal level, then yes, this wouldn't be inflationary because it would affect the expansion of the supply of goods. Okay, so some examples of this. If the unemployment rate is 11%, which is a really high rate of unemployment, this means there is lots of idle labor and likely lots of idle capital also. Monetary expansion in this case would not yield inflation, as bringing these factors back into use would most certainly increase the supply of goods. If the unemployment rate is 2%, this means there is very little idle labor and possibly zero idle capital. Monetary expansion in this case would definitely yield inflation, as there may not be any further profitable uses for capital in the economy. To use a less aggregated perspective, we can also consider what the inflation will be, depending on where the monetary expansion is directed. If the new money is directed into areas that have a very low price elasticity of supply, such as equities or real estate, then inflation will result. If the new money is directed into areas that have a very high price elasticity of supply, such as a newly booming industry with high growth potential, then there will be no inflation. Okay, so I know that I just tossed up price elasticity of supply as though it were obvious what that means. I know it isn't, but basically it means if inflation, or monetary expansion rather, is directed into sectors of the economy that respond to increased demand by expanding, then there won't be any inflation. But if it's directed into sectors of the economy which respond to increased demand not by expanding, but by simply having the price of the things increase, then yes, definitely that will result in inflation. So, right, to summarize, whether monetary expansion will be inflationary or not depends on what the conditions of the economy are and what investment decisions will be made with that new money. Before we move on, we didn't really address this, but some of the negative aspects of inflation are increased prices for things like maybe increased housing prices or increased college tuition or something like that. And also there is a more sort of obscure argument against inflation, which is that it distorts the structure of prices in a sort of kaleidoscopic fashion by percolating through the economy in such a way that it changes prices wherever it goes. I think we'll talk about this a little bit later. But other objections to inflation are that it reduces the returns on investments and the returns on loans that were made in the past. So oftentimes people say that a high rate of inflation is a threat to sort of the attractiveness of investments and loans. Okay. So in the 1930s, a group of conservative economists, perplexed at what ought to have been an impossibly severe deflation, that should be deflation then, reconsidered their assumptions and conclusions about the economy. They took to reanalyzing the monetary system. This group of conservative economists included Irving Fisher, Henry Simons, and Frank Knight, some of the most prominent public defendants of the capitalistic mode of production. After having put their heads together for some time, they released a paper which was meant to be conducive toward a drastic change in monetary policy. This paper was commonly known as the Chicago Plan. The aforementioned group of economists considered that this reform was necessary if capitalism was to survive in the future. Okay, so basically these guys were the first mainstream economists to realize that the majority of the money supply was comprised of credit money, and that this was a big problem. There are a lot of problems that this sort of situation yielded for the economy. So the points of reform included in the paper were these: a prohibition of bank-created money, privately created money, or credit money, however you want to say it; a separation of the money warehousing function with the savings investment function. Money warehousing function basically meaning how a person deposits their money into a bank and then uses those deposits to facilitate exchanges with other people. That's what we mean by the money warehousing function. And then the savings and investment function, when you deposit your money, not as a way to spend it or withdraw it later, but as a way to direct it towards businesses who are hungry for credit or investment. Governmentally issued currency only. So already this would mean no privately created money, only publicly created money. And then the money supply under this system was to be raised either by the government creating capital for the banking system or by tax cuts. How would the government create capital for the banking system? It would basically mean that the Treasury would, from there on out, be connected to the largest banks in the country, and it would basically just print up reserves for them, which they would then lend out to businesses, and this is how inflation would be, monetary expansion would be effective throughout the economy. Or by tax cuts. Okay, what does that mean? How can you expand the money supply using tax cuts? Well, tax cuts while holding the money supply otherwise constant entails monetary expansion, right? Because if the government is the sole issuer of the currency and it's issuing maybe $1,000 a year and it taxes $1,000 a year, this means that at the end of the year there is $0 in the economy. Now pretend that the government slashes its tax rate so that it will only collect $900 at the end of the year. This means that it issues $1,000 a year and then takes back $900, so that at the end of the year, what do you have? $100 in the economy. Okay, so tax cuts while holding expenditures level means monetary expansion. Another way of saying it is lowered revenues with constant expenditures means inflation. This is the reason why no serious economist recommends reducing the national debt. What does this mean? Any reductions in the national debt under our current monetary system would entail a reduction in the money supply, and thus run the risk of a deflation or even debt deflation, like in the Great Depression, which would ironically, by killing off all the businesses, dry up the government's revenue through taxation and probably result in even further indebtedness. So, what would reducing the national debt mean? it would mean bringing revenues above expenditures, which, as we know, results in a reduction of the money supply. So this is very dangerous and ill-advised, and no serious economist would recommend that the U.S. government do this. And then the fifth, platform of the general reform would be that government currency would be issued without interest, just like a coin. Bonds might sometimes be sold, but otherwise a greenback-like currency would be the normal functioning of the new monetary system. An interest-free currency is the only type which enables the national debt to be paid down. Why is that true? Well, how are you going to pay down the national debt? What are you going to use? Money that you create, right? Well, if the only type of money that you create is money that bears debt, all you can do is pay off old debts with new debts. But you'll still always have debt. So there's no way for the U.S. government, or any other government for that matter, which doesn't issue interest-free currency, to actually escape the national debt. This is a system that will always be in as long as our currency has debt attached. In this case, I'm talking about the U.S. base money, which is essentially lent into existence through bond sales. So, to reiterate, an interest-free currency is the only type which enables the national debt to be paid down without risking debt deflation. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. So, the core of the Chicago Plan is twofold. No more privately created money. Endowing banks with the ability to create money is actually an enormous privilege, which allows them to essentially place a tax on the entire money supply, minus the base money. The second principle is that government should create the money interest-free and by itself, not by selling bonds or taking on loans from private parties. As we discussed earlier, without this feature, it is impossible to escape national indebtedness, except by conquering and plundering other nations in order to pay off the principal, right? Because you can either get money by printing it, in which case it's going to bear debt. You can get money by taxing your own people, in which case this will depress their business activities and probably result in an even lower level of tax revenue. Or C, you can just take it from other people, which in the ancient world was usually the only time when governments actually became debt-free, which was right after a successful military campaign. So, in short, removing the privilege of money creation from the banks and restoring it to the state is provided for in the Constitution. Oh, as is provided for in the Constitution. Okay, so yeah, that's basically the point of the Chicago Plan. Though there are numerous benefits to such a monetary system, the main benefits these economists had in mind, meaning Irving Fisher, Henry Simons, and Frank Knight, was that it put an end to destructible money. The economy would never more have to live in fear of a massive credit event which would banish the money supply. Credit would no longer be money, and therefore money would be indestructible, rock solid, non-fragile, etc. The brightest minds in the American economic profession endorsed the paper, but it was never put into action. Senator Bronson Cutting, the politician sponsoring the bill, died in a plane crash on May 6, 1935. The political momentum for the paper dried up afterward, and it dropped into obscurity. And until now, it really had been in obscurity, but I guess the crisis of 2008 spawned a lot of curiosity in some of our modern-day economists who kind of dug up the Chicago Plan and updated its policy prescriptions so that it would sort of mesh with the modern operations of finance that we have today. So there has been this sort of renewed popularity and attention paid to the Chicago Plan, but only in light of the global financial crisis of 2008. Okay, and earlier in this page I said it's an enormous privilege granted to the banks which allows them to essentially place a tax on the entire money supply. What do I mean by this? Well, what I mean is that if the money supply were offered by the government, or the state, or whatever, issued by the public, without the interest rate, it means we would have our current money supply, compared with the system of private money creation, minus all the interest that is placed on those loans. Because, right, the loans in the aggregate are what the price level is based off of. So imagine that entire mass of loans, except without the debt attached to it. That's what our economy would be like. Now, this doesn't mean that there would be no credit afterwards. It just means that we wouldn't have to pay interest just to get to a certain money supply, because that's what we have now. We have to pay interest just to have a certain money supply. You have to be able to distinguish between money and credit to be able to understand this point, because it's quite important. Before we move on, seigniorage. The definition of seigniorage is the enjoyment of the benefit of spending freshly created currency into an economy whose prices are not yet adjusted to the new currency. This sounds complicated, but it isn't really. Prices respond easily to new currency, moving prices upwards and respond to the demand engendered by new purchasing power easily. This is in direct contrast to the situation. Prices respond easily to new currency, moving prices upwards in response to the demand engendered by the new purchasing power is easy. This is in direct contrast to the situation of deflation, where no one wants to lower their prices and respond to a conspicuous absence of demand. In the former, prices change in response to higher sales, and businesses are happy to do this. In the latter, prices change in response to lower sales, and businesses obviously are unhappy to do this. When someone creates new currency and spends it into the economy, that currency still has the same purchasing power as all the old currency that was circulating in the economy before the creation of this new currency. The new currency takes on the same purchasing power of the old currency once all of the prices in the economy have adjusted upwards to accommodate the new currency. So as the new currency passes hands through the economy, the enjoyment of the greater purchasing power lessens and lessens as prices rise and rise until prices have risen to a maximum in regards to the new currency. This means that the new currency has its greatest purchasing power at the time of its first usage, that is, when it enters the new economy. So, it has greatest purchasing power at the first transaction, the second greatest, the second transaction, and so on, because prices will rise in response to the heightened demand which the new currency engenders. So seigniorage is the enjoyment of the currency issuer of newly created purchasing power. Throughout history, seigniorage was the right of the sovereign and constituted much or even most of the sovereign's expenditures. Tax revenues contributed, but seigniorage has always been the staple source of revenue for governments, especially during periods of distress, such as war. In fact, there is compelling evidence that currency only became the standard method of facilitating exchange when soldiers were paid in currency, who then spent it in varying towns. in the roads of their campaigns, towns which had previously just used systems of repetition and credit. So, right, the sovereigns had built up big armies, and they had to pay their soldiers somehow. Soldiers didn't have time to sort of introduce themselves into a local system of credit wherever they were. So the sovereigns issued these coins, which were supposed to basically be legal tender wherever they went. Okay, so why are we talking about seigniorage? We know now that seigniorage constituted a large part of government expenditures, but in the modern era, governments are divested of the privilege of currency creation. For the most part, banks possess this privilege. Therefore, banks and their clients enjoy the fruits of seigniorage. This has multiple economic effects worth noting. First is that the bank's clients, the first users of the new currency, enjoy the effects of fresh purchasing power within an economy whose price level is suited to the older, smaller supply of money. For example, if a bank client takes out a loan to invest in something on the stock market, the fresh purchasing power will manifest as increased demand on the stock market, thus bumping up the price marginally, more than it would have were it regular old currency. So what does this mean? It means basically that using credit to speculate on the stock market actually inflates the stock market, meaning that your speculation or investment was somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because the currency that you use to effect that purchase itself pushes up the price of whatever you bought. So it adds value to your purchases. The second economic effect of banks taking this privilege of seigniorage is that those governments are deprived of it and thus must look to their citizenry to make up the difference in tax revenue. Either way, the money is going to be created. Okay, the money supply is going to be at a certain level. The difference between the scenarios is that in one, the banks create the currency, and the government must tax the people in order to make the budget, and in the second, the government enjoys the right of greater purchasing power and need not extract the remainder of the budget from the populace. In short, what does this mean? Fractional reserve banking, or private money creation, necessitates higher taxes on the populace. And as yet another criticism of the fractional reserve banking system, this is a slightly different nature. Oh, also, when we were talking about seigniorage. This effect of prices rising in response to new money is called the Cantillon effect. And what it means is that the people who receive the currency last actually have the disadvantage of paying higher prices without having enjoyed the fresh purchasing power, and the people who get it first, enjoy the entire benefit of. So that's the Cantillon effect. The people who get it last are not beneficiaries of monetary expansion. So when we were talking about inflation and some of the negative consequences of inflation, one of the negative consequences of inflation would be the Cantillon effect, namely that the last recipients of the currency do not benefit from the monetary expansion. But as another criticism that's often leveled at the system of private money creation is that at any moment assets are outweighed by liabilities by whatever the interest rate is. So all dollars enter the economy as $1 worth of assets, but they have the $1 principal plus the 5 to 10 cents of interest attached to them. Thus, liabilities outweigh assets. On grand economy-wide scale, assets are outweighed by liabilities because of the way we create money. What does this mean for us, macroeconomically speaking? It means that in addition to the impetus for growth that is inherent to mankind, by that I mean mankind's competitive and innovative nature, competitive especially within a market context, there is the additional impetus to grow as provided by the compulsion to pay interest on debt. If growth on net flags or slows down, the risk of failure to pay off debts increases. So how does the economy continue to function in this state? Either states or businesses take on more debt in order to finance the growth to pay off the old debt. Ultimately, it is always the same. The fruits of new debt paying off the needs of the old. So this is kind of complicated to explain. I'm sure it's just as complicated to understand. But when you have liabilities outweighing assets on an economy-wide scale, it basically means that nothing in the economy, or the economy itself, won't survive without growth. If it were true that assets and liabilities were equal, the economy wouldn't need to grow really, because there would be no risk of default and bankruptcy if it didn't grow. But because liabilities do outweigh assets, there is the imperative, again, on an economy-wide scale. This is in a macroeconomic sense. We're not talking about specific market agents. We're just talking about as a whole. As a whole, the economy is compelled to grow by taking on new debt to pay off old debt. There is only one alternative from this dynamic, which is mass bankruptcy. That's the only way that debts get cleared en masse. So the economy as a whole is caught between two choices: the acquisition of greater debt to pay off old debts, or going bankrupt. There always comes a time in an economy when the marginal utility of debt becomes lower than its cost in interest due to the growth potential having been maxed out, either because of limitations on technology or consumer demand, or whatever the various specifics of a certain market are. Constant growth is what this dynamic demands, but it just isn't possible. This means that financial crisis under this system is not only a likelihood due to the inherent fragility of our credit money supply, but an inevitability, as the debt burden of an economy reaching the maturity in regards to the growth potential that it has at that point in time, compel it towards levels of growth which may not be even available. The business cycle may be thought of as the ratio of an economy hitting its debt saturation point to an economy hitting its growth potential ceiling. Saying nothing like the ability of entrepreneurs to even completely exhaust an economy of all opportunities. So, yeah, basically the way that the economy is set up is it compels us to find, as a whole, again, I'm speaking about the economy as a whole. The economy is compelled as a whole to find growth where it may not necessarily even exist. So I believe that this is why many of these business cycles ultimately reach their maturity in super high inflation in things like assets, and things like the real estate market, and things like the equities market, because the growth potential of the real economy has already been exhausted, but the debt burdens are compelling the economy to find growth somewhere, and so it finds a sort of false or phony growth by pumping up um, asset prices in the financial sector of the economy. So basically, replacing genuine growth for speculative growth. Okay, so this is sort of a side-by-side comparison of the system of fractional reserve banking, or the system of private money creation, with the system of the Chicago Plan, or full reserve banking, or a sovereign monetary system, whatever you want to call it. So you can see the pros and cons here lined up. On the con side, for private money creation, it creates specific pockets of inflation where the credit is directed, right? Because wherever money expansion is directed, that's where prices will rise. Okay. Places a tax on the entire money supply at the rate of interest. Inherently unstable, necessitates higher taxes, and compels us towards impossible levels of growth, thus necessitating a business cycle. And lastly, this is kind of a minor point, but it creates political leverage for banks, meaning that as a country and as a government, we have to support and prop up the banks because they are the stewards of the money supply. And if they fail, then that means that the money supply disappears overnight. Okay. The one positive thing about fractional reserve banking is that within this system, the banking sector is able to alter the money supply in accordance to changes in demand for money. So what this means is that if demand for credit suddenly increases quickly, then the banking sector can respond by increasing the money supply. So I think it's somewhat problematic to phrase it that way, because the demand for money is not exactly the demand for credit. Those two concepts need to remain distinct from each other. But that's one criticism that's often leveled at the Chicago Plan, is that it has no automatic mechanism for adjusting the money supply in accordance to changes in the demand for money. So how would the money supply be determined under the Chicago Plan? There are lots of different proposals for that, but we'll discuss that later. So yeah, on the con side of the Chicago Plan, or a sovereign monetary system, is inflation can be spread evenly rather than specifically by cutting taxes on households, or just by providing reserves to the large banks. The money supply is created completely free of interest. Now, again, this doesn't mean that credit is available free of interest. It just means that the money supply is available free of interest. This is kind of an abstract point, but under the system of private money creation, we have to pay for our own money supply, in addition to paying, interest on credit. But we have to pay for our own money supply. In the Chicago Plan, the money supply can be changed, altered, increased, or whatever, completely free of interest. So whatever the current interest burden is on all of that credit money, the 97% of the credit money which comprises the American economy. Imagine all of the interest being subtracted from that. Okay? So it means that money could actually come into the economy without interest. It means that assets aren't necessarily outweighed by liabilities and so on. Money supply would be completely stable, so that the economy wouldn't be under a constant risk of financial catastrophes and consequent debt deflations. Lower taxes, because the government is not deprived of seigniorage, so it doesn't need to look at us for making up the difference in the difference between its expenditures and revenues. There's no imperative to growth outside of the natural one residing in the natural productivity of mankind and in the competition between firms, and it removes the steward status of the banks regarding the money supply. So we don't need to prop up the banks, we don't need to give them political privileges or tax exemptions or anything like that, because we don't really need them in order to have a properly functioning money supply. Right, so we already talked about this. Okay. So in conclusion, whatever the method for reaching the correct money supply without the assistance of FRBs or fractional reserve banking, demand for credit functioning, can we even continue to afford the effects of fractional reserve banking and its correct money supply? So yeah, if fractional reserve banking is so good at bringing us to a correct money supply, then what does that say about what do the proponents of fractional reserve banking have to say in regard to the latest housing crisis, with the global financial crisis of 2008? Obviously, the banks made a lot of loans which they shouldn't have, right? So even this sort of function of fractional reserve banking has its own faults. So yeah, can we afford the financial booms and busts, the taxation, or even the interest taxation, meaning the interest burden that's artificially installed into our economy, the bubbles which the specific inflation mechanism engenders, meaning when banks make loans, whatever they loan the money into, the price therein increases. So this has had a particularly conspicuous effect in housing market and in the cost of the college education. We've seen lots of loans in we've seen credit in student loans expand, and it's happened. College tuition has ballooned out of sight. Or can we even afford all the subsidies and protections which we grant to the banks, and then which they use to lobby against legislation which would take away their privileges? Yeah, so even if a full reserve system did not put the money supply at the precisely correct figure, which, by the way, neither can the fractional reserve system apparently do, the detriments of the fractional reserve banking system are, once fully understood, indefensible. Okay, so I know we packed a lot into this video, and there are probably some things that I didn't explain well enough, maybe even some things that I forgot to explain. So if you have any questions regarding any of the material presented in this video, or maybe even some material that you think should have been presented in the video, then please let me know about it by leaving a comment or sending me a message. So yeah, I hope this video was informative, and we'll see you in the next installation of our series on a second look at ecoin. Thanks.